Now we're going to get started with these branches. I'm going to try and break it down to make it a little bit more simple because I know it's a lot that we learned in just a day. So what we're going to be talking about is the three branches of the trigeminal nerve. Even though the trigeminal nerve has three main branches, these three main branches have their own branches which we have to know. So the three main branches is the ophthalmic, the maxillary, and the mandibular. So first we're going to go over the ophthalmic nerve. This is a sensory nerve for the cornea, the eyeball, the orbitofrontal, and the ethmoid sinuses. All of these branches enter through the superior orbital fissure. The three main branches of the ophthalmic nerve is the frontal nerve, the lacrimal nerve, and the nasociliary. But these branches have their own branches as well. So in this picture, you can kind of see the frontal nerve, the nasociliary, and the lacrimal nerve. It's in the ophthalmic nerve. They're all circled in different colors. So here is a little layout of the branches. So as you can see, the ophthalmic nerve is the main branch. It has three other main branches, the frontal nerve, the lacrimal nerve, and the nasociliary nerve. The frontal nerve, however, has two branches of its own, the supraorbital and the supratrochlear. The lacrimal nerve doesn't have any branches. The nasociliary nerve has four branches, the infratrochlear, the ciliary, the anterior, and the posterior. However, the anterior branches out into the external and internal nasal nerves. I know this may seem like a lot, but let's break it down. So, the frontal nerve has two branches of its own, the supraorbital and the supratrochlear. The way that I remember it is when you look at the frontal part of the skull, it is the head, as in your forehead in that area. And so everything above the eye, basically. So frontal has all the supra nerves. The supraorbital nerve emerges through the supraorbital notch. It carries sensory responses from the skin above the eye, the forehead, and the anterior scalp. The supratrochlear nerve carries sensory responses from the skin of the bridge of the nose and medial portion of the upper eyelid. This nerve is right under the supraorbital nerve. And let's see if it's on the picture here. So as you see, supraorbital is up here and supratrochlear is right under it. All right. Now, the lacrimal nerve, this runs on the lateral roof of the orbit. It joins the frontal and nasociliary nerves at the superior orbital fissure. This carries responses from the lateral portion of the upper eyelid and the lacrimal gland, and it conveys parasympathetic fibers to the lacrimal gland. As y'all can see, it's a lot of la. So lacrimal, lateral roof, lacrimal nerve, lacrimal gland. And again, this one does go through the superior orbital fissure as well. The nasociliary nerve is the third main branch, and this one joins frontal and lacrimal nerves at the superior orbital fissure. The nasociliary nerve has four branches. It has the infratrochlear nerve, the ciliary nerve, the anterior ethmoidal nerve, which will then branch out into internal and external, and then the posterior ethmoidal nerve. Okay, so a weird way that I remember this and it sticks is the frontal is like the first kid, lacrimal is the middle child, and nasociliary is the youngest child. So basically, frontal is the overachiever, always wants to be superior at things, hence the supraorbital, supratrochlear. Lacrimal is the middle child. No one likes the middle child, so the middle child doesn't get any branches. And I'm sorry if you are a middle child and you're watching this, I'm just using a stereotype. Don't be triggered. And then a nasociliary is like the youngest child. They're usually spoiled, which is why they get four branches, which is the most out of all this whole trigeminal nerve. The four branches is the most. And to make it even better, the anterior branch of the nasociliary nerve gets its own branch as well, which is the internal and external. So maybe that kind of helps break things down if you look at it in a human sense. But let's go back to the nasal branches. So the nasociliary branch has the infratrochlear nerve. This carries sensory responses from the skin of the medial portion of the eyelids and the side of the nose. The ciliary nerves carry sensory receptors from the eyeball. A way that I personally remember ciliary nerves is I think of hair when I hear ciliary, and I think of like my eyelash and how annoying eyelashes are when they get in your eyes, they get on your nerves. So ciliary nerves, I think of eyeball automatically, and these carry sensory receptors from the eyeball. Anterior and posterior ethmoidal nerve. So these carry sensory receptors from the nasal cavity and the paranasal cavity. Remember that anterior does get two more branches because nasociliary is the spoiled youngest child. The two branches are the external and the internal nasal nerves. The external carries the receptors from the skin of the ala and the apex of the nose, and the internal carries responses from the anterior portion of the nasal septum, lateral walls of the nasal cavity. So external has to do with the apex, internal has to do with the actual walls inside the nasal cavity. All right, so that was all V1. Let's see if you understood what I just explained. What are the three main branches of the trigeminal nerve, or the three kids? Oh, I'm sorry. What are the three main branches of the trigeminal nerve in general? So that's ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular. What are the main nerves or the siblings of the ophthalmic nerve? That's what I was trying to say on the last one. That is frontal, which is the first child, the overachiever, wants to be superior at everything. The lacrimal, the middle child, gets nothing. And the nasociliary, the youngest child that gets an extra branch. What nerves does the frontal have, or the overachiever? The frontal nerve has the supraorbital and the supratrochlear. What nerves does the lacrimal have? The lacrimal has no nerves because no one likes the lacrimal branch. Which nerves does the nasociliary have? Remember, this is the spoiled one, so there's an extra one that you don't want to forget. The nasociliary has the infratrochlear nerve, ciliary nerve, anterior and posterior ethmoidal nerve, and the anterior portion has the internal and external. Which nerve gets sensory responses from the eyeball? Remember when there's an eyelash in your hair and it irritates you, it gets on your nerves? That's the ciliary nerve. Which nerve deals with the skin of the ala and the apex of the nose? Remember, this is the outside. That is the external nasal nerve. Which nerve deals with the lateral portion of the upper eyelid and is responsible for creating tears because no one likes them, they don't get a branch? The lacrimal nerve. Which nerve deals with the skin above the eye, the forehead, and the anterior scalp? The supraorbital nerve. All right, now we're going to go over V2, which is the maxillary nerve. This nerve enters the skull through the foramen rotundum, and the branches follow the distribution of the maxillary arteries. It carries sensation for the maxilla, the overlying skin, the sinuses, the nasal cavity, the palate, and the nasopharynx. A way that I remember this is your maxillary arch is your top teeth. So put your hand right on top of that, like over your skin, obviously, and just keep it there. And if you breathe regular, A, you can feel your sinuses or the air coming out of your nose. B, you can tell, hey, the maxillary arch is a part of the palatal surface of your mouth. So that's another way you can remember it. And obviously sensation for the maxilla because it's the maxillary nerve. So there are just some ways to remember it just in case she does ask what it carries sensation for. So here is the maxillary nerve right here of the trigeminal, that orange part. All right, so the branches of the maxillary nerve, sorry, I'm trying to zoom in. So the main branches are the zygomatic, the infraorbital, the posterior superior, the greater and lesser, and the nasopalatine. The zygomatic nerve then branches into two branches, and these are very easy to remember because they both have the word zygomatic in them. And the infraorbital has the anterior and middle, and then it doesn't like the posteriors. The posterior is by itself, the greater and lesser is by themselves, and the nasopalatine is by themselves. All right, and this explanation is what I just said. If you guys want to pause and read, you can. So the zygomatic nerve runs along the lateral orbit floor. It enters the pterygopalatine fossa via the inferior orbital fissure, and it conveys parasympathetic fibers to the lacrimal gland. The two branches of the zygomatic nerve is the zygomaticofacial and the zygomaticotemporal. The zygomaticofacial is a sensory nerve for the skin of the cheek, and the zygomaticotemporal is the sensory nerve for the skin of the temporal region. So if you get confused about zygomaticofacial and cheek, back on I think the first week of school, we learned about how if your posterior teeth, they can be called facial or buccal, and buccal means cheek. So that's one way to remember it. And then the word temporal is literally in the second one, so it obviously has to do with the temporal region. So the next main branch after this is the infraorbital nerve. And the infraorbital nerve, or IO, is formed by merging of the branches of the upper lip, the medial portion of your cheek, the lower eyelid, and the side of the nose. This passes through the infraorbital foramen and runs posteriorly to join the ASA nerve. So the anterior superior alveolar nerve, or the ASA, this carries sensation from the dental branches and the pulp tissue of the maxillary anterior teeth and associated periodontium and buccal gingiva. This exits through the apical foramen. And any one of these, the MSA, the PSA, the ASA, all of these exit through the apical foramen. The ASA receives branches from surrounding periodontium, forming a nerve network which innervates the facial gingiva, and the ASA often crosses the midline. The MSA, or the middle superior alveolar nerve, carries sensation from the dental branches and the pulp tissue of the maxillary premolar teeth and MB root of the first molar associated with periodontium and buccal gingiva. And like I said before, the MSA does exit through the apical foramen. It is part of the maxillary nerve plexus, and it ascends the wall of the maxillary sinus to join the infraorbital nerve. The MSA is not present in all patients, and when it's absent, the ASA and the PSA innervate. Now, the PSA. Remember, this is not a part of the IO branch. PSA is by himself. PSA carries sensation from the dental branches in the DB and palatal of the first molar, pulp tissue of the second and third maxillary molars, and it's associated with the buccal gingiva and periodontium and part of the maxillary sinus. The PSA exits through the apical foramen as well. It is part of the maxillary nerve plexus. This one exits through the maxillary tuberosity, the posterior superior alveolar foramina, and it joins the IO nerve or maxillary nerve in the pterygopalatine fossa. So just in case you get confused, here's the main thing. When it comes to the IO, the ASA exits through the apical foramen. The MSA exits through the apical foramen. And so does PSA. It exits through the apical foramen. But the main difference between these is the fact that IO passes through the infraorbital foramen. ASA passes through the infraorbital foramen, infraorbital nerve. And then MSA has to do with the infraorbital nerve. However, PSA has nothing to do with the infraorbital nerve. It has to do with the posterior superior alveolar foramina, which has to do with the name as well. The greater and lesser palatine nerves, both of these ascend from the palate through the pterygopalatine canal to join the maxillary nerve. So the greater anterior palatine nerve is located between the mucoperiosteum and the bone of the hard palate. It carries sensation for the posterior hard palate and the posterior lingual gingiva. It enters the greater palatine foramen and it travels in the pterygopalatine canal with the greater palatine blood vessels. So the way that I remember this is that the greater stays with the greater. It's like the rich and the poor, basically, because the lesser stays with the lesser. So the lesser carries sensation for the soft palate. It enters the lesser palatine foramen and it travels in the pterygopalatine canal with the lesser palatine blood vessels. The lateral nasal bridges. This joins the palatine nerves in the pterygopalatine canal and it carries sensation from the posterior nasal cavity. The nasopalatine nerve originates in the mucosa of the anterior hard palate. It is paired nerves that enter the incisive canal by the way of the incisive foramen beneath the incisive papilla. It travels along the nasal septum and carries sensation from the anterior hard palate and the lingual gingiva of the maxillary anterior teeth and nasal septal tissues. Okay, if you're confused, this is one way that I remember it, and somehow my friends find this very appealing and it's been helping them as well. But a scenario that you could think of when it comes to this is someone won't shut up at a sleepover. You tell them to zip it good night via text, so it looks like zip GN. So Z would be the zygomatic nerve, I would be the infraorbital nerve, P would be the posterior superior, G would be the greater and lesser palatine nerve, and the N would be the nasopalatine nerve. So what was most common in the maxillary nerve branches? Remember that the maxillary is right under your nose and sinuses, so most of these had to do with the infraorbital fissure versus the ophthalmic had to do with the supraorbital fissure. The greater palatine is like an annoying rich person that has to keep stating how great they are, i.e. the hard palate, the greater veins. The lesser palatine is like the kid who gets bullied or like the poor person, and they keep stating how much they suck, i.e. the soft palate, the lesser veins. The nasal branches are not listed on the branch summary because they're just randoms that carry sensation from the posterior nasal cavity. The nasopalatine has to do with the hard palate and nasal septal tissues. And then the ASA, MSA, PSA all exit through the apical foramen. Now, you guys can pause to answer the questions. The answers will come right after this slide. So, which sensory nerve deals with the skin of the temporal region? The zygomatical temporal nerve. What travels in a pterygopalatine canal with the greater palatine blood vessels? The greater palatine nerves. What carries sensation from the posterior nasal cavity? The lateral nasal branches. The ASA, the MSA, and the PSA all exit through what? The apical foramen. What deals with the skin of the cheek? The zygomatical facial nerve. Now we're going to talk about the mandibular nerve, which is V3. I don't have questions for these yet, but I'll make sure to add them to the next video that I make. So the mandibular nerve, or V3, is the largest of the three divisions. This passes through the foramen ovale, and it joins the ophthalmic and the maxillary divisions to form the trigeminal ganglion, and it's a motor root of the trigeminal, and it accompanies the sensory component. So here are the branches, and I think this was my least favorite to review. The mandibular nerve has to split into prior branches before it can even go to the trunks. The two branches that it has to split into is the meningeal branch, which is afferent for the dura, and the muscular branch, which is good for the medial pterygoid nerve, and it's efferent nerve for the medial pterygoid muscle, the tensor tympani muscle, and the tensor veli palatine muscle. Once that's done, then we can go to the trunks. The anterior trunk only has two, which is the buccal nerve and the muscular branches. The posterior trunk has three, the auriculotemporal nerve. I really messed that up. Excuse me. Then we have the lingual nerve, and then we have the inferior alveolar nerve. However, the inferior alveolar nerve splits into three more branches, which is the mylohyoid nerve, the mental nerve, and the incisive nerve. So if you're still confused, I have a picture right after this. This is just a screenshot of what I just stated. You guys can review this and pause it if you want to read it again. But here is, I drew this on my iPad earlier today, but one way that you can remember this is the mandibular nerve is from the comes out from the ovale foramen. So if she asks, which I doubt that she will because she didn't go over it, but the mandibular nerve is the first arch. And the way you can tell is that the M has a 1 in it. Now, the way you can tell if it's what foramen it goes through is by the alphabet. When you go to the alphabet, M, N, O, P, so M, mandibular nerve, N for nerve, and O for the ovale foramen. The branches that it has to break into first before it can turn into the trunks is the um, meningeal branch and the muscular branch, which has to do with the medial pterygoid nerve. And all these have to do with the letter M. And then once that's done, you go to the anterior trunk, and I immediately think of BAM. B being the buccal nerve, A being the anterior trunk, and M being the muscular branches. Then you go to the posterior trunk, and the way I like to remember it is posterior ali. If you sound it out, you get ALI, posterior ali. And so A would be the auriculotemporal nerve, L would be the lingual nerve, and I would be the inferior alveolar nerve. But remember, inferior alveolar nerve has its own branch. So I immediately think of I miss my iPad. So you got the inferior alveolar nerve, the mylohyoid nerve, the mental nerve, and the incisive nerve. So now we're going to go into details for each branch. The two branches that prior to the split are the meningeal branches and the muscular branches, which are right here. For the anterior trunk, there's two of them. Remember, it's buccal and muscular. Bam. So the buccal nerve, or the long buccal nerve, is located on the surface of the buccinator muscle. This does not innervate the buccinator muscle. It carries sensation from the skin of the cheek, the buccal mucosa, and the buccal gingiva of the mandibular posterior teeth. And there's the buccal nerve right there. And this is just a picture that she showed us of where it would go if you wanted to give anesthesia. So here's the incisive foramen right here in green, and here's the mental foramen here in green, and the yellow would be where you would put the buccal block. And again, the posterior teeth are usually the buccal portions as well. If you want to pause and look at that, you can. All right, and the anterior trunk has the three muscular branches. These arise from the motor root of the trigeminal nerve. The motor nerve supplying the three other muscles of mastication are the anterior and posterior deep temporal nerves, the lateral pterygoid nerve, and the mesenteric nerve. I'm not sure if she'll ask about this because even if you read in the book, it doesn't go into much details about the specific muscular branches. It just says three muscular branches. The posterior trunk has three of them. Remember, it has posterior ali, so it's auriculotemporal, lingual, and inferior alveolar nerve. The posterior trunk. Now we're going to go over the auriculotemporal nerve. This travels with the superficial temporal artery and vein. It carries sensation for the parotid, external ear, scalp, and the TMJ. It carries parasympathetic fibers to the parotid gland, and it joins by the lesser protrusal branch of ninth after relay in the optic ganglion. The lingual nerve, lingual obviously means tongue. This carries a sensation for the body of the tongue, floor of the mouth, and lingual gingiva of the mandibular teeth. This also communicates with the submandibular ganglion. It travels with the parasympathetic innervation for sublingual and submandibular glands via the chorda tympani nerve. The posterior trunk, I'm so sorry. Okay, the posterior trunk is formed, the inferior alveolar nerve is formed by merging of the mental and incisive nerves. It carries sensation from the mandibular teeth. More information about the inferior alveolar nerve is that it travels in the mandibular canal with the inferior alveolar artery and vein. It is joined by the dental, interdental, and interradicular branches from the mandibular, forming the dental plexus. It exits the mandible through the mandibular foramen and joins the mylohyoid nerve close to the lingual nerve. The mental nerve is the external branches that carry sensations from the chin, lower lip, and labial mucosa from the anterior teeth and premolars. This enters through the mental foramen and merges with the incisive nerve to form the inferior alveolar nerve. This carries sensation from pulp tissue of the anterior and premolar teeth, and it exits through the apical foramen and joins the interdental branches from the surrounding periodontium. It merges with the mental nerve to form the inferior alveolar nerve. The mylohyoid nerve runs in the mylohyoid groove onto the inferior surface of the mylohyoid muscle. It joins the inferior alveolar nerve after outside the mandibular foramen. The motor nerve supplying the mylohyoid muscle and the anterior belly of digastric muscle. All right, I only have a few questions. So, which nerve carries sensation from the skin of the cheek, the buccal mucous membranes, and the buccal gingiva of the mandibular posterior teeth? That is the buccal or the long buccal nerve. What carries sensation for the external ear and scalp? Again, ear should be an automatic hint. That is the auriculotemporal nerve. This carries sensation for the body of the tongue, the floor of the mouth, and the lingual gingiva of the mandibular teeth. That is the lingual nerve. Again, tongue should have given that away. This carries sensations from pulp tissue of anterior and premolar teeth. That is the incisive nerve. And that is all I have for today. We're going to finish, I'm going to make another video going over the other branches as well.